Hello, this is the Bite Weasel, and in this video we'll be continuing our Roblox Tycoon game by taking a look at how to add a functioning rebirth system. So hopefully you've been following along in the series and you have a pretty decent Tycoon now. You know, you have the ability to earn money, spend it on buttons, you can use Robux on things, you have screen UI, you have effects and sounds and all sorts of good stuff. I think the only major missing mechanic that I can think of is a rebirth system. So that's what we're going to look at in this episode. And I think it's going to be pretty straightforward. So, if you're not familiar, a rebirth system is basically a way to reset your entire tycoon back to zero, but have some sort of multiplier given to you so that next time you build up the tycoon, you do it faster and you can get further because you start earning more money more quickly, right? And we already have a concept of changing the amount of money that you earn. So, either in the upgraders, which I guess is the second one that you can buy, this sort of changes an individual item's value as it goes through. But we also have our Robux button here that gives you double money forever. So if I was to buy this, in a real game, it would cost me Robux. But this sort of adds a one-time multiplier to the game. And so a rebirth system is going to work very similar to this. When you rebirth, will basically reset your entire tycoon back to the beginning, but you'll have some sort of permanent buff that you can use to earn more money more quickly. Some rebirth systems work slightly differently. They sort of give you a currency that you can then spend on things. And so it's pretty easy to sort of decide how you want to use that rebirth system once it's in place. So let's look at how we would add a new button that sort of unlocks at some point to say, you can now rebirth by starting your factory again with some sort of, multiplier or currency that you can spend. So how can we do that? Well, we already have a notion of buttons that you can stand on to buy things that get shown after you unlock certain other things. It's these regular buttons. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is just copy one of these. So let's grab one of these buttons and duplicate it. And then let's sort of move it along to a place in our tycoon that would be good for rebirths. So I'm just going to cram it in this corner here. And because it's going to be slightly different to the other buttons, I think I will change the color. So instead of green, a rebirth can be, I don't know, yellowy, orange, like that. And just for myself, so that I know this button is the rebirth system, we can rename this label in our UI. Right, so now when I look, in design mode, I'll see that this is the rebirth button because I've changed that. But if you recall, when the game actually starts up, each button will get added by this script, and we'll sort of update that button's labels based on the object that it is linked to. So right now, this is linked to an incorrect item. It's probably the one that I didn't duplicate when I clicked it, so we can have a look. Not that it really matters, but we'll go to the reference to the object. Yeah, so right now it's trying to build this thing. So instead, we'll want something that this rebirth button can buy, even though it's not really going to be a real thing at all. But the way that our button system works is it wants something that it can unlock. So let's just add a random model in here, and we'll rename it to be a rebirth. So our system continues to work by getting the name of this and updating the button at runtime. So if I go back to the button now and I point item to buy, I should change it to that rebirth model. So the model doesn't really do anything. It's just an invisible model somewhere, but it will hook up the button now. So if I play, we've hit some of our code. If you remember in the previous episodes, we sort of added this protection system so that if I forget to do something with a new button, I get warned about it. So you can see none of the factories worked because I didn't update our unlock ID. So that's cool because I wouldn't have thought about that if that didn't warn us. So let's go down here to our attributes, find our unlock ID, and give this a unique one. We'll just call it rebirth. And of course, we should change the cost. I don't know what a rebirth should cost. Probably more than 1,000, but I want to be able to test it, so we'll just add a little bit more. But in your game, you definitely need to balance the cost of these things and the order in which they unlock. And speaking of order in which they unlock, now that we've updated this unlock ID, we need to also go into our, I think it was helpers, yeah, to add that unlock ID into our list of how things get unlocked. So for us, let's pretend that the rebirth system unlocks nothing new, so we just add it into this list, but it is going to be shown after you buy Big Dropper 1, right? That will allow us to show the rebirth button. So if I try that now, we should not get any errors. And if I go and play the game all the way through until I get to Big Dropper 1, let's just boost it here with some fake Robux. Yes, I'd like to buy that, please. Thank you. That will just help us earn money faster so we can get through testing this. There we go. So this is Big Dropper 1. Now, after I unlock this one, once I get 700 money, we now unlock the Rebirth button, which over here is now shown because that all works. And if I stand on this, assuming I had enough money, it should rebirth the system, but obviously it doesn't because we haven't done that bit yet. So that's what we're going to look at next. And we sort of talked about this. When we have a button or dropper or whatever, an item that mostly works like every other thing in the system, but has some special behavior, the easiest way to add that special behavior is to just tag that button. So here we'll just add a tag for rebirth so that in our button script, we can look for that tag and make it behave slightly differently when that happens, when this button is bought. So here's our existing button script. On pressed is when someone stands on it. And assuming that they have enough money, they buy the item. And that's what happens for regular buttons. But for rebirth, we don't really actually need to buy anything at all. Instead, we need to reset the entire factory. And because we've just added that tag on the button, we can look up that tag right here to make sure that it's either a regular button because it doesn't have that tag, or it's our special one-off rebirth button. So we can go button dot hashtag, colon hashtag, rebirth. And we'll say if it doesn't have a rebirth tag, then we can do all of this regular stuff. For most buttons, they will not have that. Otherwise, what do we need to do when it's a rebirth happening? Well, we should set the money back to 0. That makes sense. And we should also probably set some sort of rebirth item, value to be 1 extra. Like we should increment it. Now, obviously, the profile doesn't have a rebirth sort of count or currency or whatever it is that you want to increment when you do a rebirth. But we can simply add that. We go into our data script, we go up to our profile template, and just like we added products sold recently, we can add a rebirth count. Set it to 0 to begin with, and now that's going to be incremented whenever you stand on this rebirth button, and it's going to cost you all the money in the world because you'll reset that back to 0. And this is cool because just adding those 2 lines of code means that now anywhere we want to show our rebirth count, we suddenly can, because the profile template is going to be updated by profile store. And the way that we added in last episode, this proxy thing means that when that changes, the client is going to get notified about it. So for example, if I go into the client script inside this sort of event handler for when the data has updated, sorry, it's the client GUI script, we could actually do something with that rebirth value. So just as an example, we could say, print data dot rebirth count. So this actually won't be any use in a published game because you won't really see this, but testing will just show you that this could work. So we could add another text label, or we could add something else in our UI that shows, the rebirth count, and it will all just work with such a small amount of code. And so this is a really good way of creating your system because it means as you add on more and more of these mechanics, you don't have to rewrite anything. It just neatly slots into our existing system, which I think is really cool. So there, we're going to reset money to 0. We're going to have the rebirth count incremented, but the one thing that we're missing is to actually reset the factory. So how can we do that? Well, if we look at our factory script, we sort of already have this notion of creating a new factory. Because when a player leaves, we sort of destroy the old factory and clone a brand new one. So what if we did this almost the exact same code when someone rebirths? Because we basically want to throw away the current factory, make a new one, but the main difference is we want it assigned to the player that just rebirthed rather than, being set to no one owns this one, someone can take it. So how can we do that? Well, a similar way to how we did everything else in here. We could basically add a new sort of event that the factory can listen to. So that's one way of getting our button script when you press something to talk to our factory script. Inside our server script service, we can add a new event, much like we added this game pass check. We can add a new bindable event. We can call that bindable event like a rebirth, something like that. And we can fire this event from our button script when they stand on it, and we can sort of listen to it in our factory script so that we know that we need to reset and reclone that factory. So why don't we do that? We can say server script storage. Do we not actually have a reference to that? No, we don't. It looks like we call this over and over again. So it might be nice to just say server script service equals game get service, and we can sort of use that here and here. Oops. A couple of extra brackets in there. So now we can also use it here. We can say dot rebirth, and we can fire it. And we can say fire. And what do we want to say? Well, we basically want to say the owner has rebirthed. So we'll pass in the player as the parameter. Pretty simple. It's the same way that we sort of fired these other events from this button, except this one goes across to the client and this one just stays on the server. So inside our factories, we can do a similar thing. Let's get a copy of this script server script service. In fact, we could just copy it here. And we can update these things to just use it so that we're not calling get service over and over. And then down here, under player added, player removed, profile update connected, we can say rebirth dot event connect. And it's going to be a new function that takes in the player that just rebirthed their factory. Cool. So now we are ready to reclone the factory. So we sort of need to get rid of the current factory and make a brand new one. So how can we do that? Well, let's take a look at how it works in player removing. So right now, when a player leaves the server, we loop through the workspace factories folder, and we find the factory that this player owns, right? By looking at the factory's attribute called owner and making sure that it matches this user ID. So this is good. We can do this exact same code here so far. So let's take that. So we'll find the factory that this player owns by looking at the user ID and the owner attribute. Then we will find the plot for the current factory, destroy this factory, we'll remove it from there, and we'll clone it. Now, the problem is, one thing that we've not done after we've cloned it is we need to do this code, right? We're almost acting as if a player has left, and then that exact same player rejoined straight away. So we could take this code, right, this exact code, and paste it under there. That would work. Or we can just refactor it a little bit so that we don't need to have a copy of this code in case we change the things that happen when you assign a factory to an owner, right? We already updated this code, between building it and then later on having a new mechanic. So you can imagine in the future, we might also have to edit this code. So instead of copying and pasting it, let's just take this and move it into its own local function. Much like we have a clone plot function, we can have a local function. We'll call it assign factory. And we'll paste in that code here, and it takes in the factory, which is some sort of model, and it should take in the player, which is a player, right? And that's going to do all that work. And then inside our player added, we can basically call that function. Assign the factory, this factory, to the player. And that means we can also take this and inside our rebirth, as soon as we've destroyed everything, we can also assign it, right? We're going to clone the plot, which I believe makes a brand new factory, correct? Factories clone plot. Yeah, what we should really do is return this out. So we can say return clone. Cool. So the clone is the new factory. So now in our rebirth, we can say factory now equals the cloned plot, and that's what we're going to assign to the player. So will this work? I'm not entirely sure. Actually, thinking about it, it won't work because we've forgotten to do one important thing. Back in our buttons, we've reset the money and we added a new rebirth count, but we still have all the exact same unlocked items. So if we were to destroy the factory and reclone it, all of those items would get rebought and you'd be exactly where you were when you stood on the button. So what we need to do instead is set the unlocked items to be a brand new empty table. So now when you reclone the factory and it tries to buy all the unlocked items, it won't buy anything because we don't have any, right? That makes sense. If we rebirth, we remove the money, we add a rebirth, and then we get rid of all the items that you'd unlocked because you're starting again. So that's cool. But now thinking about it, I've also noticed one other issue in that inside here, our profile, we did work last episode to make it so that when you change the profile, we write out an event that, anyone can listen to say, hey, the profile's been updated. So we don't have to fire an event manually. If you remember that, that's from the last episode. And now looking at this line of code, I'm noticing that there's going to be a problem inside the way that we did that. So let's quickly fix that. So if I go over to our data script where we sort of hooked into this magical meta table stuff of Lua, which is down in our create proxy function from last episode, one thing that I've noticed is when we set a new item, remember we call this special behavior function, but when that is set to a table, we're going to have a problem because this sub proxy sort of table isn't cleared out. So even though we set a new table as a value, this is still going to be correct for that key. So we're never going to get information about that new table. So what we really need to do is check if the value is a table, much like we did up here in our getter. In the setter, we also need to check if it's a table. And if it is a table and we have a proxy key for that table value, then let's just clear it out. Which means next time you call the getter to get that table value, you're going to make a new proxy. I know it's another complicated thing about special behaviors, but this will make it work so that when you set a new table value, the getter for that table value will make it work correctly. So this should have been a correction last episode, but I've only just noticed it now. So make sure you add this bit of code if you're using the create proxy meta table stuff. But now we're in good stead. I think we When we rebirth by standing on the button, we get money cleared out, we get a new rebirth, and we clear the unlocked items, and we fire an event. The event will destroy the old factory, clone a new one, and assign that new factory to the player. So in theory, this should work. Let's find out. Again, I'm going to have to earn a bit of money to get there. Hopefully you are loading with a profile service, so it takes you a bit quicker. But also what we could do for testing is probably just update our profile template so the default isn't 0 anymore. We could give ourselves some money, right? I don't know why I'm starting from 0 every time when I'm just testing, but it's too late now. We'll do that if we do some more testing later on. So we get the big dropper, which unlocks the rebirth, and we start getting a ton of money now because the big dropper is worth a lot. So now, hopefully, if I stand on this, we see that indeed the factory gets deleted and gets recloned. Hopefully, if I look at this sign, we're still assigned it. Let's take a look. Yeah, it's been reassigned to us, and I should be able to buy stuff now from the beginning. Yay! Yeah, so it's working. Our money got reset. Our products did not get reset, which makes sense. This is sort of a count of how many products we've ever made. Probably you're not going to want to track that on the screen because it's kind of boring, but you might want to do it for a leaderboard or something like that. So there you go, a rebirth system that sort of works. We can rebirth by clearing out our factory and starting again. The main thing that's missing, of course, is using that rebirth sort of value to either increase a multiplier or perhaps as currency to spend on some other set of buttons that don't use money. They use rebirth currency. For now, we're just going to show you the easy way to do it, which is in our sellers. We already do something very similar. In our sellers, if you have the double money game pass, then we sort of multiply the worth by something. So now we can also say, well, if you have a rebirth count, greater than 0, then we're going to times it by the rebirth count plus 1, right? Because the first rebirth count is 1. So timesing anything by 1 won't change the value. So the first time the rebirth count will be 1, but we're going to times it by 2. And then when you rebirth again, you'll get a times 3 multiplier, and so on and so on. Yeah, so I think that is cool. Of course, for your tycoon, you're going to want to think about balancing your numbers. Right now, I've just done the easiest thing I can think of, which is just cramming in numbers anywhere. Like these things are worth 100, which is actually, a lot to begin with. And these buttons I've sort of incremented that one was 300 and now it's 400, but the walls are only 200. Like none of my numbers make that much sense. So multiplying it by, the amount of times you've rebirthed is not great because I'm going to get really ridiculous numbers really fast. And with such a short tycoon, that's not what. But now I'm making money way faster than I was before. So getting back to that point where I'm ready to rebirth is much quicker. Too quick for this game, but in yours, you've hopefully balanced it. And there we can go and go. So now, second time, I should get, 3 times the money. So they're still worth 100 there, but when you sell them, boom, they're worth 300. So what we could do is make this value, immediate. The rebirth maybe affects the base value of the item rather than the final selling value. So that will just depend on how you want to sort of use your rebirth currency now that we've sort of created it. And I'm expecting you to customize your game so it's much more fun to play than the one that we've made in here. But just to show you how you would do that is instead of grabbing the profile when you sell it and checking the rebirth count, what you could do is inside the droppers, we could grab the profile, right? So the way that you would do that is slightly more complicated because we don't have access to some of these things. So we need to copy this from our seller script into our dropper script. So here we're going to drop the new value and we sort of give the, drop value as the item value, right? So we can actually change that here. So what we're going to do is before we update the initial value of that dropped item, we're going to find the owner for the dropper, right? By going dropper.parent, get the owner. We need access to the player's server so we can look up that ID and find the correct player. So we'll copy that in there. And then once we have the player, we are going to then grab the data for that player, which again, we need to sort of copy. But it's a lot easier to copy code that you know already works than it is to write code from scratch. So I think this is still pretty neat. So we grab the data, we get the profile, and then I guess I deleted it, but we would copy the piece that we just wrote. What we're going to do is say if there's a profile and the profile has a rebirth count greater than 0, we're going to make some initial value worth more, right? So we can say local worth is whatever the default value of the dropper is. And we're going to multiply it up somehow, and then we'll set that to the value. And the act of setting this attribute's value is going to update the text on our little drop item there because of this handler, which you saw in an earlier episode. So let's just fix up this. Worth is times the profile rebirth count plus 1. Like that. So now, instead of when you sell the item, it's worth more, when the item is first dropped, it will be worth more based on your rebirth count. So you can, of course, decide how you want to change your values using that rebirth system. But this just gives you 2 options now, and you can pick and choose between those 2 or make up your own third and better option. It's completely up to you. These tutorial series are really like teaching you how to do something, and then you sort of go away and hopefully use that knowledge to apply it to your own game in your own way. So I got to buy this before I can go to the rebirth. And now we should see that the rebirth value has updated the original worth of that item. So let's take a look. I've now rebirthed once, which we don't actually see on the UI anywhere. So we should probably add that at some point. But now when it drops, it should be worth 200. And it is because we've rebirthed once. So we get some multiplier. Of course, again, this is going to change your balancing numbers because the upgrader is going to go from 200 to 400. If I have that double money game pass, that's going to make it even bigger, So some things to work on the balance of the game, but the rebirth system is working, and it's working pretty nicely. Yeah. And we didn't have to write that much code, right? All we did is we basically copied and pasted things from our existing mechanics. We added a new button, and we just added a single tag. Otherwise, it works the same way as all our other buttons. We updated this slightly so that if it's a rebirth button down here, we change the profile. And then in the factory, we listen to that rebirth event, and we just do the exact same thing that happens if player goes away, and the same thing if a player joined. And that just works. So that's really nice. So there you have a functioning rebirth system. Now, before I disappear, I do want to just show you one issue that you might have with your factory. And that is, say for some reason in your mechanic, when you rebirth, you actually want to give them a free item, right? You don't set the unlocked item back to 0 for some reason. Instead, you always unlock the first dropper button or something, right? So you've, instead of setting it back to nothing, you've set it to, what is it, dropper 1 equals true. I don't know. However you've decided to do it. It's like I can't remember how you write Lua. Funny stuff. Yeah, you set dropper1 equals to true to give them that free button, right? Say you want to do that. Well, you're going to hit an issue because of the way that our factory sort of immediately clones and assigns it. The problem is that when you assign the factory, you buy all those items, which is what this is doing. You buy those items that are in the unlock item thing. The problem is because we've cloned it and we're buying stuff in the exact same frame, depending on the order at which Roblox decides to actually create things, the collector service could run. That's this collection service. This could run and try and set up our buttons before everything's finished cloning, just because of the way sort of Roblox works in cloning sub items from things. So a really, really simple way to fix this, just in case you decide to do it that way, is to do something like this. Make sure that you've cloned the plot and then wait until the next frame before you assign the factory. So something like task.delay, delay for 0 seconds, which should just move it into the new, the next frame, and then assign the factory on that next frame. That will make it a lot safer if you decide to not reset the buttons back to 0, but have some free button, right? I'm not saying you should do this, but if you decide to do it that way, you definitely need to sort of assign the factory which buys the items in the frame after everything's been cloned. Otherwise, you'll hit some issues with the collection service. So now I'll just show you that that works. So you have another sort of idea under your belt to sort of customize your own game. You can give them free items when they rebirth. This should work. So if we go there, sort of double everything, rebirth, we should see that the first dropper gets bought immediately. And you'll see that it does, and it should start dropping at 200. So that works great, and it was just a small change there to our initial code. So there you go, a rebirth system that works. Cool. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, leave a comment, ring that notification bell, all that good stuff, and I will see you next time.